Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center at Michigan State University. Eye on Africa is our weekly seminary series. And today I'm very happy to have with us Dr. Chérif Diatta as our guest speaker. And before I pass it on to him, a brief introduction. Dr. Diatta is a former Fulbright student at Tulane University. Dr. Chérif got his PhD in Caribbean and African diaspora studies in 2015. From 2014 to 2015, he taught courses at Tulane University, 20th-Century Caribbean Writers, and Modern Caribbean Women Writers. Currently, Dr. Diatta is an assistant professor at the English department of Cheikh Anta Diop University. Dr. Diatta has published several articles. His research and teaching essentially focus on Caribbean and African diaspora studies, literature, mainly 20th century and contemporary Caribbean literature, history, civilization, culture, institution, etc. Dr. Diatta is mainly interested in questions related to identity, memory, history, religion, revolution, slavery, politics, nation building, gender, and diasporic utopias. Dr. Diatta has also served as Director of Studies of the Applied Foreign Language Institute of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at Cheikh Anta Diop University. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We're delighted to have you. Now I pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sar. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm honored and privileged to take part in this Eye on Africa program, an African Studies Center speaker series at Michigan State University. Please, Dr. Sar, allow me to thank Dr. Jose Gaxamalete, the director of the Alliance for African Partnership of Michigan State University, who introduced me to you, Dr. Sar. Special mention to Professor Nair, my supervisor at Tulane University, and her husband, Professor Gaurav Desai, all professors now at Michigan State University. Thank you for your contribution to my education. The topic I would like to introduce today is counter-memory and the reshaping of Caribbean discourse in the works of Aimé Césaire and Edouard Glissant. I will be delighted to welcome your questions and comments at the end of my presentation. Edouard Glissant's Caribbean Discourse, an essay, and Aimé Césaire's Notebook of a Return to the Native Land, a poem, both illustrate an intricate elaboration of memory and history. Memory represents the faculty by which the mind retains information or past events, whereas history stands for the science that studies events that have occurred in the past. Both memory and history share a common point that relates to the record of past events. Yet, in Glissant's and Césaire's works, memory and history are usually in conflict, enacted through the painful rapport between the Antillean or Caribbean subject and history, which embodies the erasure of collective or social memory. Scholars have conceived of that erasure as a result of the silencing of historical events in colonial narratives and chronicles. This argument resonates in the works of Michel Rolfe Trujillo, Derek Walcott, and Kama Brathwaite, to name but a few. Other studies focusing on nation building in post-war Germany have emphasized tensions, differences, disputes, mnemonic fracture lines, and identity cleavages that divide citizens to explain the rupture of collective consciousness, namely the works of Andreas Gleiser, Konrad Jarausch, Michael Minkenberg, Gerard Schweitzer, and Jeremy Strong. In the context of the West Indies, or the Caribbean, one can agree that the silencing of the past can have contributed to the fracture of collective memory. However, and more importantly, the fragmented history of the Caribbean remained the foundation of the erasure of social memory. Focusing on historiography and literary criticism, this study examines the origin and underlying factors of the fragmentation of collective consciousness in Glissant's Caribbean Discourse and Césaire's Notebook. Based on a post-colonial approach, this analysis additionally looks at the author's literary and ideological responses to the issues of identity construction in the colonial and post-colonial West Indies. It is thus important here to emphasize that in the respective works of Glissant and Césaire, memory erasure stems from the fragmented and which engenders an identity crisis facing the Antillean subject. I further posit that the fracture of collective consciousness prompts a counter-memory through remembrance linked with literary imagination and creation in both Glissant's and Césaire's discourses, despite their different perspectives. For Glissant, counter-memory entails the creation of new histories and the rejection of a history through uncanonical mediums. As for Césaire, it stands for a reclamation of the dignity and freedom of the Black race, an assertion of a negritude embodying universal humanism. This paper therefore focuses on two main points. Firstly, non-history and the fragmentation of collective consciousness. And last but not least, counter-memory, remembrance, discourse, and the reconstruction of Caribbean identity. Like I just said, the first main point of this presentation includes non-history and the fragmentation of collective memory that I would like to touch upon. Historians and literary critics have had different understanding of the inherent factors underpinning the malfunction of collective memory. For some, social issues, when unresolved, are likely to cause collective memory dislocation. According to Jeremy Strong, historical events that engender conflicts over the very constitution and contours of an imagined community, if left unresolved, can seriously jeopardize the future prospect of collective memory and national identity. For Howard Schuman and Jacqueline Scott, the impact of wars, famines, and revolutions might endanger the consciousness of individuals depending on the generation. Concerning Karl Mannheim, he believed that these events may further disaggregate individuals within generations into opposing political factions or units. He additionally argued that the variegated collections of events do not always coalesce into nationalized identities and collectivized memories. They can also cultivate fragmented mnemonic legacies. For other historians and critics, the silencing of past events in history shapes the rupture of collective consciousness, especially in the particular context of the West Indies. For instance, in Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History, Haitian historian Michel Rolfe-Trujillo emphasizes two types of silences. On the one hand, silences that are inherent to history, which involves events that enter history while losing some of their constituting components. On the other hand, Trujillo highlights a type of hegemonic silencing engendered by an uneven power in the production of sources, archives, and narratives, with the example of the Western historiographical dismissal of the Haitian Revolution. Concerning St. Lucian poet, playwright, and literary critic Derek Walcott, it characterizes the fragments of memory through the metaphor of the vase broken into pieces to suggest silence and unrecorded histories of the West Indies. As he says, quote, Antillean art is this restoration of our shattered history, our shards of vocabulary, our archipelago becoming a synonym for pieces broken off from the original continent, end of quote. Walcott highlights here the discontinuity marking Caribbean histories equated with the people's broken languages and the severed and dispersed small islands. In Glissant's and Césaire's works, the erasure of memory mainly occurs as an effect of non-history, that is to say, the absence of history. In Caribbean discourse, Glissant conceives of memory erasure as resulting from the fragmented Caribbean history, which dates back to the early period of the archipelago, with the advent of the unprecedented violent triangular commerce. Glissant states that the Caribbean is the site of a history characterized by ruptures, and that began with the brutal dislocation, the slave trade. The fragmentation of the history of the Caribbean gets emphasized by colonization and the existence of a dominant history that rejects Afro-Caribbean people's contribution to its evolution. Therefore, the past that is represented by the mainstream history does not represent the histories of the latter. That explains the factors of the dislocation of the continuum and the incapacity of a Martinican people to access collective consciousness, a phenomenon that is characteristic of what Glissant names non-history. For Glissant, this non-history remains an essential factor of the rupture of collective memory in the Caribbean. The inscription of non-history in Glissant's Caribbean discourse also showcases the irresponsibility and alienation of the Martinican elite. Firstly, this elite simply conceives of history as pleasure. Glissant views that the Martinican elite conceive power only in the shape of the woman, of the female deity, empress, queen, courtesan. History is for them nothing but a submission to pleasure, where the male is dominant, the female is the other. The notion of history as pleasure is about making oneself available. Glissant's argument hardly explains why the Martinican elite live on consumption of foreign products. It is an elite that only cares about their representation in the French Parliament. Lastly, the Martinican elite articulates a discourse disconnected from any notion of community. This discourse, or the discourse they produce, appears to be void of any dynamic of collectivity, reflecting a delirious character, which, according to Glissant, results from the sterility of the traditional oral discourse. This broken discourse suffers from diglossia, folklorism, and the absence of control over material production. Henceforth, the fragmentation of the Martinican history characterizes the alienation and sterile discourse of the Martinican elite. In Césaire's work, the fractured memory takes on aspects of a memory in pain, a suffering memory. Notebook introduces a poet who, on the verge of his return home, or on the verge of returning home, lives moments of remembrance. Yet, his memories not present happy images. They encompass the violent slave trade, disastrous effects of natural catastrophes, i.e. volcano explosions and people's misery. These memories haunt the poet and even make him hesitate as to going back home. As he says, to go away, my heart was pounding with emphatic generosity. To go away, I would arrive asleep, young in this land of mine, and I would say to this land, whose long is part of my flesh, I have wandered for a long time, and I'm coming back to the deserted areas of your souls. On page 13 and 14. The use of the conditional form here indicates the hesitation of the poet who not only seeks self-definition, but also intends to stand for his people. At his sudden arrival, on page 14 of the book, the poet sees a society that is characteristic of moral and material desolation. The evocation of the grievances that embody the past of the West Indians is a statement of the poet's awareness of a collective trauma, a consciousness of a wretched people under colonization and shameless exploitation by a handful of Westerners. In this respect, Notebook emerges as a cry against injustice, or as Viola Urella describes it, a cahier de doléances, with the implication of an imperious demand for redress and justice. This denunciation of injustice remains a prelude to claims for democracy as a way to restore racial justice as proposed by Pierre Card. Both Glissant and Césaire's works characterize the foundation of the dislocation of Caribbean memory, highlighting Western historical interventions on the Caribbean space and its people through Atlantic slavery, colonization, as well as the production of a colonial hegemonic historical narrative. While Césaire mainly indicts the Occident of the Caribbean subject psychological ills, Glissant additionally accuses the Caribbean elite of their historical irresponsibilities. The motives of memory erasure in the Caribbean involve both exogenous and endogenous influences. So this leads to the discussion on the second main point, which is counter-memory, remembrance, discourse, and the reconstruction of Caribbean identity. George Lipsitz defines counter-memory as a way of remembering and forgetting that starts with the local, the immediate, and the personal. Inspiring himself from Michel Foucault's understanding of the concept, Lipsitz demonstrates how counter-memory looks to the past for the hidden histories excluded from dominant narratives. And it forces revision of existing histories by supplying new perspectives about the past. This definition resonates with Jose Calmero's concept of collective memory. For Calmero, the term refers to an alternative to official national historiography, potentially giving voice to the subject traditionally excluded from representation, minority and subaltern groups on the basis of cultural contingencies such as ethnicity, language, class, gender, and sexuality, among others. Addressing the wounds suffered by collective consciousness therefore amounts to establishing a counter memory through the work of remembrance associated with cultural reconnections, literary creation, and orality. French philosopher Paul Ricoeur theorized the work of remembrance in response to Primo Levi's advocacy of the duty of remembrance. In the duty of remembrance, the individual is subject to remembrance, whereas in the work of remembrance, he or she can remember, but can also forget as part of a therapeutic or national reconciliation process. Ricoeur's work of remembrance is in tune with some scholars' conception of counter-memory. Ernest Renan suggests that the persistence of a cohesive national identity will depend on the willingness of each new generation to remember and forget the same events of the past and to imagine a common future together. He further claims that it is necessary that historical events be imploded as part of a national memory, systematic selection, and permission. For Walcott, access to memories of slavery is a source of self-torment. So he proposes that the children of slaves must share their memory with a torch. Indeed, as he claims, amnesia remains a cure for historical trauma. In Walcott's conception, amnesia or forgetfulness involves a therapeutic process. It is thus important here to analyze the ways in which Césaire and Glissant approach remembrance as counter memory. The first point we'll highlight here is counter memory, Césaire, and ancestral reconnection. Césaire's introduction of counter memory entails the restoration of a collective memory through cultural reconnection, enacting a psychological journey back to African ancestral value. As a matter of fact, considering that Caribbean history is not always represented in positive images, and that Afro-Caribbean's dignity relentlessly faces colonial undermining, Césaire makes a detour towards ancestral roots as a self-recovery process. This shows the poet's inner belief and acceptance of the morbidity of Caribbean past in Notebook. To Saint Louverture, the hero of the Haitian Revolution is even dramatically represented. Quote, a lone man imprisoned in whiteness, a man alone in the sterile sea of white sand. Death traces the shining circle of this man. Césaire later confesses that we were all the times pretty mediocre dishwashers, shoe blacks without ambition, and best conscious sorcerers, and the only unquestionable record that broke was that of endurance under the shikhat. This fragmented and dislocated image of Caribbean history is a source of psychological dissonance, tormenting the Antillean subject, which urges Césaire to reorient his gaze towards Africa with self-awareness. However, since Africa is remote, his reconnection with the continent of origin epitomizes the yearning of a quest for his ancestral roots, as seen in the poet's evocation of his Bella writing images in Notebook. The king of Dahomey, the princess of Ghana with 800 camels, the wise men in Timbuktu under asking the graves, the architects of Djenné, Medes, and African warriors. Indeed, Césaire's celebration of Africa enacts his acceptance of negative as counter-memory, standing for an affirmation of the pride and dignity of the Black race, undermined by Western civilization for centuries. Glissant corroborates this idea as it contends. Quote, The historical need, as it contends, the historical need for the creolized people of the small islands of the French Caribbean lay claim to the African element of their past, which was for so long scorned, oppressed, denied by the prevalent ideology, is sufficient in itself to justify the negative movement in the Caribbean, in the code on page 24. Glissant's argument validates negativity as a punctual response to colonial ideological hegemony in the West Indies. Also, Césaire's negatives as counter-memory rejects petrifying images of the African continent while rebutting symbols of Western hegemony. As the poet tells us in Notebook, my negative is not a stone. Its deafness hurled against the clamor of the day. My negative is not a leukemia of dead liquid over the earth's dead eye. My negative is neither tower nor cathedral. It takes roots in the ardent flesh of the sky, breaks through the opaque frustration with its upright patience. On page 35. Here, negative not only claims for a fulfilling African heritage, but it also underscores a refutation of Western scientific and technological culture, epitomized by the tower and the cathedral. However, Césaire's negative does not fall into racialized essentialism. Though it calls for the liberation of the Black race, it speaks to a universal idea. As the poet says, quote, my heart preserves me from all hatred. Do not make me into that man of hatred for whom I feel only hatred. For entrenched as I am in this unique race, you still know my tyrannical love. You know that it's not from hatred of other races that I demand of myself to become a whore for this unique race. That what I want is for universal hunger, for universal thirst, to summon it to generate, free at last from its intimate closeness, the succulence of fruit, freedom. On page 38, 39. In the above lines, negative underscores a universal humanism, which says here, like Senegalese poet Léopold Senghor promotes. The second point in this section emphasizes counter memory, glissant, literary creation, and orality. If with Césaire, remembrance as counter memory involves cultural reconnections, with glissant, it implicates recalling historical events which favor Caribbean peoples, fulfilling reappropriation of their past as a way to access collective consciousness. Here, counter memory alludes to the control of historical time, an antidote to the psychological disequilibrium of the Antillean subject. For glissant, this endeavor should not be carried out by historians only, but also by literary scholars. Literary creation has become a necessity in the face of the erasure of the collective memory. Literature can fill the gap where history as a science is deficient. As Glissant argues, when a people faces issues of collective memory, history, as far as it is a discipline and claims to clarify the reality lived by these people, will suffer from a serious epistemological deficiency. It will not know how to make the link. The problem faced by the collective consciousness makes a creative approach necessary. In the rigid demands made by the historical approach can constitute, if they are not restrained, a paralyzing handicap. That's on page 61. Glissant further claims that history as a consciousness at work, and history as lived experience are therefore not the business of historians exclusively. Literature for us will not be divided in genres, but will implicate all the perspective of all the human science. On page 65. Caribbean literature therefore appears to be a participant in bridging nation and culture, thus creating history. According to Glisson, such an exploration is subject to neither schematic chronology nor nostalgic lamentation. This notion is what Glisson terms as prophetic vision of the past. That is to say, an exploration that leads to the identification of a painful notion of time and its full projection forward into the future, without the help of those plateaus in time from which the West has benefited, without the help of that collective density that is the primary value of an ancestral cultural argument. That is on page 65. Literary creation of histories constitutes an act of creative restoration of the historicity of a people that has been silenced in the mainstream history. Literature, therefore, has the potential to create new history, an act that represents, at the same time, a repudiation of the history with capital H and the production of a counter memory, while discarding longing for ancestral roots. Like literature, Glisson upholds orality as a fundamental means to access or retain collective memory. Literature supplements history in the way the oral tradition fills the gap where writing is deficient. Firstly, Glisson sees this enterprise in the revival and valorization of the Creole language, a language that bears the marks of orality, but remains so much altered in writing. The distortion of the linguistic markers of orality will most probably be detrimental to the community's language and consequently the collective consciousness. As Glisson views it, quote, if such an operation is conductive against a community whose oral language bears the secret, unlikely, and elusive stamp of the written one. This is the case as well as we shall see with the Creole language in Martinique. Dispossession is likely to be terminal. A close scrutiny of this dispossession is one way of fighting against collective self-destruction. That's on page 12. The restoration of the oral aspects of the Creole language remains indeed an essential step towards the recovery of collective consciousness as counter-memory. These are oral linguistic characteristics. These oral linguistic characteristics enable the writer to represent Caribbean historical reality and experience with images and symbols proper to authentic Caribbean discourse. Walcott similarly views that the caring and painful act of reassembling the fragments of memory has the potential of renaming and finding new metaphors to articulate experience that departs from the imposed foundations of colonial language and discourse. Secondly, Glisson proposes folk tales as a marker of orality that contributes to the preservation of collective memory. For Glisson, the tale plays a double function. On the one hand, it can fill the gaps of history and thus keeps the writer from developing a paralyzing longing for history. On the other hand, it functions as an anti-decree, an anti-law, that is to say, anti-writing. That is on page 84. And lastly, Glisson inscribes music as a performative art type that conveys oral forms. These aspects exclude any conventional discourse and aesthetic social representations. In this respect, Paul Gilroy posits that the musical patterns and musical sensibility are a medium to engage with different forms of counter memory. As a matter of fact, music as an art form has the ability to recapture and revive the memory of communities while promoting a counter-hegemonic discourse. To conclude my presentation, I would say that Glissant's Caribbean Discourse and Césaire's Notebook have meaningfully inscribed the work of remembrance as the pathway towards overcoming the trauma of the West Indian subject that results from the fracture of collective consciousness. The fragments of history induce the Martinican authors to envision the establishment of counter memory to address the alienation of Caribbean people, which, beyond the words of historians, calls forth cultural reconnections, this very imagination and creation, the revival of orality in the written text, or in other terms, oralism. The analysis has shown different perspectives in the way the authors envision the humanization of the West Indians. While Césaire makes reference to elsewhere, Africa, claiming his negritude, Glissant looks at the immediate space of the Caribbean, an act that Patrick Chamoiseau et al. Label as reorientation of the gaze towards the immediate space, an embracement of Antianity or Creoleness. With Notebook and Caribbean Discourse, respectively, Césaire and Glissant have immensely contributed to the emergence and evolution of the poetics of identity in Caribbean philosophical and critical theory. This is all about my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions or comments, they're welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diatta. We have somebody in the audience who would like to know, maybe if you can type it, specifically what book you're referencing when you're talking about the page numbers, and maybe more generally, if you can tell us the works of Edouard Glissant that you are referencing, and maybe Césaire.
Can you say it again? I have it's buzzing.
I say, okay, thank you very much.
Can you say it again?
Okay, so after thanking you, I was just saying that one audience member is asking if you could talk more about the text of the specific text of Edouard Glissant and M.S. Césaire that you are referencing. Like if you can tell them, I don't know, it's an anonymous question, if you can tell them the names of the texts. Maybe just some texts from Césaire and Edouard Glissant. We can start from there.
Yes, the texts I'm dealing with here are Césaire's Caribbean Discourse, le Discours entier in French, and M.S. Césaire's Notebook of a Return to the Native Land, Cahier de Retour au Pays Natal. So these are, the texts I'm, referencing, throughout this intellectual production.
Okay. Thank you very much. And if you have audience member, if you have questions, you can type them in the Q&A. You can also raise your hands if you wanna be allowed to speak. Those are options. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Diatta, for your presentation. And I was just wondering if you can touch a little bit on the views, how Glissant more or less was kind of against Césaire's approach, like the relationship to Africa. It seems like it's not very.
Thank you, Dr. Sarr, for these interesting questions. Let me clarify, before getting deep into my response that Césaire, Edouard Glissant is a student of Césaire. All right. So we can see a sort of continuation from Césaire's pioneering works and the ongoing works by Edouard Glissant. So yes, let me say this thing. Césaire, when making reference to Africa, it was just a spontaneous action, just to address the sort of undermining of continuous, relentless, undermining of African people, or people of African descent, dignity by colonial ideology, right? So that was under high high colonization. So that was a specific period, and we can understand Césaire's reaction. Even Glissant understand why Césaire and that group of intellectuals who promoted negritude, why they did so. Césaire even understand that. However, emerging from a different, evolving from a different period, a post-colonial period, Caribbean intellectuals set to redefine themselves, right? So on that standpoint, Glissant sees that Césaire ideology does not match the reality of the West Indies. Africa does not define what the West Indian identity is. So he would propose, he would suggest a reorientation of the gaze towards the immediate space. So there are symbols of self-representation to redefine Caribbean identity. So this is why he suggests colonization. Came later and promote Creoleness, which is an end result. But for Glissant, colonization is a sort of process, because the construction of Caribbean identity is just is a process. It's not an endless it's not an end product. So yes, this is the difference, and this is why Glissant steps aside from Césaire ideology about reconnections back to Africa. So it's not Africa that defines identity, but it's the confluence of all cultural aspects that came together, that history brought together in that soil, in the part of the Western hemisphere. And if you look at even other texts by Glissant, he gives in more in-depth theories about that sort of relation, that sort of hybrid type of identity. I would like to name what's called poetics of relation. Poetic of relation, inspiring from the works of Deleuze. He gave the symbol of the raison with the rules intermingling, just as a metaphor that tells about the different cultural aspects that come together in the definition of modern Caribbean identity. Bernabé Chamoiseau and Confiant went even further and said that now we're not Africans. in éloge de la créolité, in praise of Creoleness, right? We're not Africans, we're not Europeans, we're not Asians, we're West Indians with all sort of implicated sort of identity, mixed, type, identity that, represent, Antianity or Creoleness. I'm not sure if, the answer is satisfactory, but this is what I had given as an insight in response to your question, Dr. Sarah.
Thank you very much. We have one question on the Q&A from Fatoumata Keita. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. Could you elaborate a little bit on Glissant's idea of the two mondes, or what Manta Jawara refers to as his world mentality?
This is a very complicated concept that Glissant is providing, is suggesting. The two monde is sort of global sort of vision of world identity, and he takes the example of the Caribbean archipelago, the image as the projected image, as a reference to the becoming even of the world. If we see even globalization, that people or institutions are trying to implement, we can see beforehand, in sort of work by Glissant, a sort of proposal, to that universal project. And for Glissant, even when you look at his theory of the chaos, all right, is suggesting that is even suggesting that yes, the world will emerge, from a chaos. So construction of global world, will come from that sort of this dislocated world. So yes, this is what Glissant is trying to touch upon, and that stands against what's called the identity of the one. The identity of the one, and he proposed what's called the identity of the universe. All right. So it's the world is not just one vision, right? It's not just one sort of like identity that should observe, or that should bring other people to identify themselves, or to construct themselves around that sort of identity of the one. It's diverse, and it's in a sort of global view of this world construction. But I would say it's not an easy concept to touch upon. Thank you, Professor from Mali, for this question. Fatoumata, yeah, for this care. I had a chance to meet her in Dakar. When she came to Cheikh Anta Diop University Dakar for the conference. Thank you, Fatoumata. Yeah, I'm not sure if the answer is satisfactory, but if you have some more elements to add, you're welcome to do that. Any other questions or comments?
Okay, maybe while we wait for other questions or comments, can you let us know what get you interested into the subject? Okay, so
first, when you ask me to If I could propose something for, a contribution to this program, on Africa, I said, yes, I'm a Caribbeanist. And what can I say about the Caribbean that would relate Africa, right? And the idea of memory came to my mind. And today, one of the bridges, right? One of the linking, uh, umbilical cords, represent memory. However, I did not want to engage memory in a way that, that will replicate, you know, um, canons of conventional representation of histories, where subaltern histories are, wiped out. All right. So I said, let me take it, from the bottom. All right. Looking at memory, from the bottom, from the periphery, which alludes to a sort of post-colonial stance, as trying to, look into that subject. All right. And it's, allows me to entertain that discussion and see in the evolution of Caribbean thought and critical theory how, self-representation has shifted throughout time, all right, and depending on the experiences lived by individuals and the intellectuals, the writers themselves, right? So this is what motivates, the choice of this topic, which is not an easy, one. Yeah, I confess.
Thank you very much. Mamadou, you can unmute and talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarr, and my dear friend, Dr. Diatta, for this great presentation. Unfortunately, I don't have much time. I only have 7 minutes before class. But I just wanted to come back to the first question, I think, with the brilliant answer from Dr. Diatta regarding kind of the supposedly opposition between Glissant and Césaire, and even later, as explained, with the Creolist. Yeah, I just wanted maybe to say that, one of the things that maybe the basis of that kind of opposition is sometimes like, and I think my friend Dr. Diatta did talk about it, this kind of reorientation, like people seeing Césaire's negritude or, return to Africa as a sort of what, the Creolists, they call it une vision extérieure, une vision extérieure des Antilles. And then I think this is why the focus of Glissant being more on what he calls the point d'intrication, where all the histories meet, like, and I did, I think Dr. Diatta talked a lot about that rejection of history is big H, and coming back to this notion of histories where you have like all this, entanglement of histories of the Caribbean. And I believe in Éloge de la Créolité, they do, yeah. They do acknowledge Césaire saying that, Césaire should not be seen as an anti-Creole, but as an anti-Creole. Somebody, came before, and his philosophy, his vision is really timely, and Dr. Diatta talked about it. And then, sometimes there is also that, I don't remember exactly the text of Glissant where he talks about Césaire, or insisting on that the external dimension of Césaire's thought. He says, Césaire is in fact more known in Dakar than in Fort-de-France, just wanted, to come back to this great opportunity. I do see a little bit though, with the Creolists, and particularly not all of them, not Chamoiseau, not Bernabé, but I see a little bit of tension with, Confiant. And there is a text that he wrote called Aimé Césaire ou la traversée paradoxale du siècle, where you really see kind of that tension, between like the African, the continental African, and the African in the diaspora. I mean, that text, I think, is a little bit problematic. And this is like, not all of them, but I see a little bit of tension with Bernabe. I don't know if Dr. Diatta can come back to this text or can come back to that tension that I see with the Creoles, and particularly Bernabe in that sense. And I have 4 minutes, but thank you so much. And I mean, unfortunately, I won't be able to, I know great questions are coming, and thank you so much, my dear friend, Dr. Diatta.
Thank you, Dr. B, for your brilliant contribution. He's a friend of mine and a great specialist in Edward Glissant. But thank you for this insightful contribution. Any other questions or contribution, comments?
Okay, so if you don't have any more questions or comment, we want to really thank you, Dr. Diatta, for coming today and sharing your research with us. We really appreciate it. I wanted to thank the audience also for coming in and for asking questions and making comments. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you next Thursday.